Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 3, Procurement, Part 2. It was morning now. The group had set up a camp in the forest about 2 miles northwest of the nearby city. The group had already inhaled their daily rations, which provided much-needed nourishment for the impending probe of the unknown. Jack continued shimmying his way up a hill with binoculars around his neck, straddled to his back. He had the M24 clutched in both his hands. As he kept moving along the hill's landscape, he made sure to keep his cover, using the trunks of nearby trees and thick brush that sprang from the soil. Keeping the long-distance assault weapon off the ground, he used his elbows to do most of the work, moving himself slowly forward. Eugene and Beck followed closely behind in similar fashion. As they came to the crest of the grassy hill, where tree life came to a sudden end, they stayed quiet underneath the dense shrub. Jack reached behind him and used his binoculars. He began observing the back of a large Spanish colonial-style building. 3 men, one posted at the double doors, one on the second-floor ledge, and one standing right outside the gates by the trash compactors. He turned to the 2 following him. Trash compactor makes it easy to hide the bodies, he said with a smile. Eugene rolled his eyes while his face shone from his nervous sweat, then pulled out a radio from under his jacket. A radio similar to the one Trevor had used earlier in the station wagon while dictating GPS locations. 3, he quipped as he spoke into the radio. Seth looked over at Joe. They were on their own, crouched behind a dumpster on a vacant street corner. He pulled the radio from his hip and, while giving Joe a stern glance, spoke into the device. Take care of it. We're heading in, going dark. While maintaining his serious gaze at Joe, he reached up and over the filled dumpster and placed the radio inside it on top of the piles of trash. Remember, I get the slightest vibe you're turning snitch, I'll put a bullet right between your eyes. If you were to blow our cover, the rest of my team will get away. I know I'll be dead, which leaves me nothing to lose, so I'll be sure to take you down with me. You get us through this, we'll keep our end of the deal. Joe closed his eyes in hesitation, then gave Seth a much-needed nod in confirmation. With that, the 2 stood up and began walking in stride across the street towards a small pickup truck that they had acquired the night before. Seth noticed, as they were crossing an eerie, semi-occupied town, people wandered about, seemingly with no objectives, while others simply stared at the two newcomers from nearby windows. The houses and buildings were in disrepair. Not a single car traveled the city streets, although plenty were available for use. The two made their way toward their vehicle, as Seth kept an eye out for any unwanted developments. They both simultaneously opened both doors and sat inside the truck, Joe in the driver's seat. Joe started it up, and they were off. As they slowly took a corner, ahead of them, situated amongst other buildings, sat the Capitol. The building was 3 stories at its tallest, but was split off into sections, comprised of only 2 levels. There were numerous palm trees lining multiple courtyards around the facility. Courtyards were surrounded by tall iron gates that met the city sidewalks. As they moved closer to the building, Seth noticed 2 men posted outside the gates of the fence, which were positioned wide open and led to the front entrance. Closer they came, the more armed guards he noticed. Men were positioned on the structure's 2nd and 3rd level ledges, and also on the roof of the complex. It appeared that the details Joe had given them in the strategizing planning the night before were very accurate. He took note of the 2 armed guards that stood at the gates as they pointed their rifles to the air while maintaining them closely by their sides. At the same time, they each put their hands out towards the approaching vehicle, signaling it to halt. As they came to a full stop, a guard approached Joe in the driver's seat. "This area is off limits. Turn your vehicle around." Joe looked at the guard and respectfully responded, "We have a meeting with the Chancellor." The guard stepped closer and peered into the vehicle at Seth. Seth nervously looked forward, attempting to keep his cool and not raise any flags. The guard carefully examined the interior of the truck's cab, then glanced to the bed of the truck. A large army-like crate caught the eye of the guard while he began to approach it. As he extended his arm toward the crate to inspect it, Joe distracted him. "The Chancellor has been expecting us. Paco sent us and is awaiting our return. Our business at hand is private and has to do with your trade alliance with the Russians. Chancellor is desperate to obtain this parcel as soon as possible." The guard, while his hand lay on the latch to the crate in the back of the truck, hesitated for a moment, then retracted his arm and placed his hand across his chest on a small radio harnessed to his opposite shoulder. "Paco has 2 men here claiming to have a delivery for the Chancellor," he stated as he walked away from the vehicle to secure some privacy for his radioed conversation. Another guard stood at attention, watching the 2 from outside Seth's door. The 2 sat inside the truck in silence, anticipating what came over the radio next. Suddenly, a non-discernible voice came over the crackly radio. The guard quickly made a one-word response, turned around and signaled to his partner as they both waved the vehicle through. All the while, an armed guard near a trash compactor stood in the crosshairs of Jack's M24. Eugene and Beck watched Jack take one last short breath as he pulled the trigger. With that, the guard doubled over and took a faceplant into the pavement. Immediately, Jack moved his weapon ever so slightly to the left and raised it the tiniest bit and pulled the trigger again. Another man doubled over and fell flat to the ground, this time right outside of 2 double doors. Again, Jack immediately moved his weapon, this time a little ways up and slightly to the right, and pulled again. Another man then joined the corpses on the ground. It was all over within a few seconds. The 3 hurriedly made their way down the grassy hill and climbed over a fence to what appeared to be a loading dock. As they all made their ways over the fence, they moved on to quickly cross the empty lot among the 3 dead bodies. They all stopped quickly and maintained silence as Beck opened the door. Armed with her new silenced pistol she gained from their previous supply windfall, she breached the building, followed closely by her team. They now found themselves inside a kitchen. As they quietly scrambled to make their way around all the stainless steel counters, Eugene bumped into something. A large metal bowl fell onto the tile ground and made a loud metallic echo throughout the room. The three froze, waiting to hear any response to the disturbance Eugene had caused. In silence, they looked at one another, each holding their weapons. After what felt like a lifetime, they continued across the kitchen, eventually making their way to the doors leading them to a back hallway of the complex. Eugene carefully peered through the crack of the door he had slightly begun to open. He looked back at the other two and whispered. Just like Joe said, one guard. Peck looked around quickly, and she bent over to pick up an orange that had rolled across the room from where Eugene had earlier displaced it. She handed Eugene the orange. Eugene gave her a nod of agreement. An armed man, posted in a lengthy corridor, standing guard, noticed the weirdest thing happen in front of him. A fruit, which looked like an orange, rolled softly across the carpet from the kitchen, directly across to a room on the other side of the hall. He slowly approached the slightly ajar kitchen doors that the fruit had rolled from. He peered around the corner of the door jamb to scan the inside of it while slowly opening the door with the back of his arm. Immediately, a hand reached out and grabbed the man by the back of his neck and yanked him inside while another hand disarmed him. Meanwhile, Joe and Seth pulled up to the entrance of the front of the building. A few more armed men were awaiting them under a couple large arches that led to a vast, covered, Spanish-style tile patio. As they pulled the vehicle to the curb, two men opened the large, oversized cathedral-like doors. The occupants of the visiting truck quickly stepped out of the cab and around to the back of the vehicle. Seth lowered the tailgate as Joe jumped up into the bed and proceeded to slide the crate towards Seth. Once the crate was in position, Joe climbed back down and lifted the crate from the truck, and the two men carried it through the archway onto the patio. They were signaled by a man in army fatigues to stop. Raise your arms, the man ordered. Seth and Joe put the crate down momentarily and proceeded to be checked for weapons. Once they were cleared by the cartel bouncer, they picked up the crate and proceeded through the doors past the two armed guards. A man wearing casual jeans, but sporting a suit jacket while dangling a large, expensive gold chain around his neck, approached the two carrying their crate. The man immediately recognized Joe. Joey boy. Joe looked up at the man, and the two placed the crate on the ground between them. Hey, Santiago. Good to see you. It's been too long. It certainly has, Santiago replied. My brother will be right with you. He's dealing with some unfinished business at the moment. Joe smiled. Understood. Santiago matched Joe's smile. It was wonderful to see you, my friend. Perhaps later we can catch up. And with that, Santiago exited the room, the same way the two had come in. Brother? Seth asked as he looked at Joe. The Chancellor, Joe replied. Just then, three people, young but not children, walked by them and followed Santiago out the doors. Seth could tell they were not members of the cartel, but rather appeared to be average citizens. They didn't seem scared, nervous, or anything like that, but they also didn't come across as your happy-go-lucky type. They held their heads down as they walked and avoided eye contact with anyone. As they left the chamber doors, seemingly to follow Santiago, perhaps as helpers, Seth noticed something. Each of them had a large, flat device implanted on the hind side of their right calves, a tiny blue light blinking away. This peculiar observation struck his curiosity. He'd seen these tracking devices before. He began to look around the room they were in. It was a large, spacious room with several doors leading to other chambers surrounding it. It had a large stairwell that wrapped one side of the interior and navigated the second floor. There was no power to the building, but it still kept plenty of light provided by the sizable sunroof positioned in the center of the massive cathedral ceiling. "What is this?" A demanding voice came from the stairs' second-level landing. The Chancellor looked down at them. He was a tall, dark, slender man with a well-tailored suit and a meticulously trimmed beard. He wore a lot of gold jewelry and spoke with a thick Hispanic accent. Joe and Seth shared glances and directed their attention to the Chancellor. "A gift from Paco," Joe exclaimed. The Chancellor looked down at the crate and then refocused his attention at Joe. "I am not interested in souvenirs. And who the hell is this?" The Chancellor barked as he made his way down the flight of stairs. "A new recruit." "Seth," Joe replied, his voice lowering as the Chancellor neared. The Chancellor passed right by Joe and Seth without even looking at them. He walked over to a large table. "I want my payment today," he announced to the room. Joe turned his head to look at the Chancellor. "Of course. It's on the boat. Paco is just tying up some loose ends and is planning on being back within a couple of hours." The Chancellor scowled at the two and looked between them at the crate. He then made a gesture in the air for them to bring the crate to him and then gave the table a couple loud taps. The two men lifted up the crate and carried it to the Chancellor and hefted it up on the table. The Chancellor looked at the two almost in disgust, rolled his eyes and began to unlatch the crate. After undoing the first latch, he undid the second one. Suddenly, without warning, the lid of the crate burst open and a shadow emerged, as if it were being birthed from within the shallow container. The now fully erect figure that rose from the crate swiftly pointed a 9mm between the Chancellor's eyes. While training its weapon upon the cartel leader's brow, it slowly lifted its once bowed head and focused its eyes on the Chancellor. The man that came from within the chest, now intensely focused at the target in front of him, turned out to be none other than Trevor Meeks himself. The Chancellor put his arms out in a sign of forfeit and began swearing in Spanish. Several men ran from an adjacent room, attempting to come to the Chancellor's aid. "Hold it right there, gentlemen," shouted a voice from a dark hallway opposite the room the men had entered from. Through the shadows of the hallway emerged Jack, Eugene, and Beck, all pointing weapons at the Chancellor's armed cavalry. The armed men answered in kind and pointed their weapons right back at the three. "I don't think that's such a smart idea, boys," Jack announced. "You see, if anything happens to us, my Jack-in-the-Box killer clown over there will turn your boss's head into a pretty little canoe." They drew their attention to their boss with a pistol trained on the center of his forehead and slowly placed their weapons on the ground. "You guys aren't as stupid as you look. Kick them away." The men did as Jack instructed them to. "This isn't a war we want," Trevor snarled. "And I don't know why caged humans on the brink of death could be anyone's prize. Frankly, I don't want to know. This is your lucky day, Lazar." The Chancellor, having not been called Lazar for years, lifted his head slightly and met Trevor's eyes. "I'm going to make you a deal. You want your precious cargo? Well, we know where it is. Once you have us on one of your planes, with plenty of supplies, and we're headed on our way, we'll radio you the GPS location of where we hit it. This is your best chance of finding them," Trevor continued, as he maintained his stern expression. "We disabled their tracking devices," he said, finishing his words off with a menacing wink while forming a slight grin across his face. "How can I possibly trust you?" the Chancellor retorted. "I need that parcel by today, and with pulses, or the Russians will destroy me." Trevor cocked his loaded pistol in response to the Chancellor's argument. "We can explore other options if you'd like." No, it's fine," the Chancellor shouted. The Ecuadorian woodlands began to grow weary of the afternoon, as it put in for a change of scenery. While slowly responding to the request, the evening stars began to appear in the vast Southern American skies. A small dirt airstrip cut into the thick forest provided a long enough path for Trevor's team and their plane to muster up enough speed to take flight and disappear into the distance. So, what's going on between the Russians and the cartels anyway? Seth asked Joe as the 9 of them climbed altitude in the Cessna Denali that Jack was currently operating. I mean, really, human trafficking usually pertains to hard labor workers or sex slaves. Those people, well, they weren't even people anymore. They were practically dead. One even whispered to Eugene, begging us to kill them. Joe, numb to the practice he had embraced for so many years under the direction of Paco, replied, "I don't know. We just provided the transportation. We didn't ask any questions." That was the arrangement. Whatever deal they brokered with the Russians was above our pay grade. This process was simply a system established for obtaining new assets. It's heard that the Chancellor is just as in the dark as the rest of us are. We were told he was simply charged with procurement in exchange for protection. Paco found out that the Chancellor wasn't afraid of the Russians, but he was terrified of who the Russians were working for. "And who's that?" Beck added. Joe turned to see Beck, sitting in the seat directly behind him. Nobody knows. Everyone has their different theories. But in all the years I've worked for Paco, I've never met one single person that has ever seen or laid eyes on the Russians' client. The plane was silent as they all stared on at Joe in disgust for his complicity of the diabolical web he'd been immersed in all these years. Seth just shook his head and closed his eyes in disbelief. In the meantime, near the coast, within the thick and now dark forest, a rumble of vehicle engines disturbed the silence that once echoed there. A thick layer of fog that once belonged to the nearby seas began to take residence within the thicket. 3 military jeeps came to an abrupt sliding stop over the grassy, muddy terrain underneath the thick canopy. Chancellor jumped out from the first vehicle, making a splash in a dark, murky puddle, not caring about his expensive tailored suit. While studying a small, ripped piece of paper with GPS coordinates scribbled on it, he hit the ground running, followed closely by his men armed with flashlights. He slowed his pace as his parcel slowly came into focus under the dancing lights of his men's flashlights. He stopped to see a shallow grave with a tomb over it. As his heart sunk and all his blood began draining from his veins, a colossal sense of anger mixed with fear took him over as he read the words inscribed on a headstone. 5 heroes lay here. 5 brave people who gave their lives. 5 strong people who brought us signs of salvation. And 5 great people who brought an end to Lazar's reign of terror by ushering in the Russian onslaught now upon his doorstep. May God keep you. Chapter 4. Mirage. It was a staggering 103 degrees in Quartzsite, Arizona. Copper-like trails, gracefully played throughout the skies, provided by the sands of the vast Sonoran Desert below. The arrays of dust blew gently, then broke into clouds of discord as they met their demise along a large metal post that held up the lengthy metal-woven fence to either side. Atop the metal stud, fastened with screws, rested a dingy yellow sign that read, "No trespassing." Off in the distance, beyond the thin protective layer of metal fencing, sat a large, sprawling farmhouse made up of decorative stone and wood siding, mired in its peeling paint. Creatively wrapping the house were large, beautiful arched windows that carried the Arizona sunlight in through the rustic domicile and brightened the varnished hardwood floors within the home. The interior was immersed in a silence it rarely heard before, with the soft ticking sound of a battery-operated clock that hung on the backsplash of the galley-style kitchen's double sink. Other than the flood of light that seemed to lazily drift along the floors, the house was dimly lit. The living room was expansive in the single-story home and was raised a few steps higher than the adjacent foyer, which led to the exterior wood entry doors. Then, suddenly, a few loud knocks as a voice came from the front patio beyond the closed doors. "Jack, you in there?" the visitor loudly questioned. A few knocks shortly followed. "Hello? Anybody home?" questioned the voice one more time. Then, slowly, with a little resistance from one of the aging, lever-handled doorknobs, the door began to open. Little by little, the door continued to open until finally it was fully ajar. Just outside the doorframe stood a tall silhouette of a man darkened by the sunlight behind him, flooding the entryway. As he cautiously walked in, his face became clearer as he attempted again to gain the attention of any potential occupants. It was Thomas, Seth's father. "Hello, anyone?" he said again with a growing expression of disappointment. He peered around a few corners, taking in the emptiness of the residence. While still seeming to anticipate some sort of response, he double-checked his trail leading back to where he had come from, seemingly checking on something or someone he held importance with. Having made himself comfortable with whatever it was he had just checked on, he began to explore once more. He was now standing in the open field, next to the side of the home, studying the doors that were before him. They were large, makeshift doors that almost lay flat on the ground, with the bottom of the doors flush to the dirt. They angled slightly in a way that the tops of the doors were about 2 feet high. There was a latch fastened to the door that was sitting in an open position that one could close and lock when not in use. Thomas reached down and opened the 2 heavy wooden doors and looked down to a dark stairwell. He looked around while squinting his eyes, protecting them from the sun to see if maybe anyone was perhaps out on the property. All he could see were a couple of horses grazing on some weeds off in the distance, but within the fence. He looked back down into the darkness, hesitated a little, and then carefully made his way down the steps. As he slowly made his way to the bottom, his eyes adjusted to the semi-darkness that surrounded him. He noticed a dim light emanating from around a concrete corner. "Anyone down here?" he asked as he began to peer around a corner into a lightly lit room. As his eyes made their way around the bend to gather the entirety of the room, now within his line of sight, he was greeted with a gun pointed directly at his head. "I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing on my property, but I'm going to give you 3 seconds to turn around and go back the way you came," Jack said, with commanding authority in his voice. With his hands now in the air, Thomas nervously hesitated while stammering his words about. You don't understand. I was sheltering with my son. He's out in the car now," he noted as he timidly gestured up the stairs. Jack looked past the intruder up the stairs and turned his scowl back towards his unwanted visitor. We were in the basement of a school in San Diego. I think we ran into your grandkids, the older one, Beck. She gave me this address. I promised I'd get them here. Jack's face went blank with astonishment. Thomas and Jack rounded the corner of the century-old farmhouse and gazed upon a dusty green Honda Civic. The back doors sprung open. Gramps! Both the kids shouted in desperate and excited voices. The kids began to run towards their grandfather, with pure joy written all over their faces. Behind them, a young Seth, indifferent to the situation, slowly removed himself from the front passenger seat of the car and watched the teary reunion unfold. Jack, matching the excitement of his family, ran up to them and reached out to catch the incoming youngsters before embracing them with a hug undefinable by words. After several moments of holding them tight, he stood back, teary-eyed, and looked at the two. "How?" he asked. Beck gave a big smile. "Your address was in my phone. Before it died, I wrote down everything I could out of it that seemed important." Her Gramps let out a huge sigh of relief as he laughed aloud. While still holding his enormous grin, he looked at his little grandson. "And you've gotten big, Tiger." Tiger was Trevor's nickname that his Gramps had bestowed upon him when he was first conceived. After that, the name seemed to catch on, as most of his family addressed him as such. Once, knowing she was carrying a boy, Jack would ask Trevor's mother how his Tiger was doing, while she still held him in her womb. The nickname always brought a big smile to the little boy's face. Once more, Jack took them in for another big embrace. Jack held the two while looking over at Thomas. "Thank you, stranger." As Seth walked up to his dad, the two of them looked on at the scene in front of them with a sense of happiness as they both maintained mellow smiles. Jack, while still holding onto their shoulders, moved the two kids back a few feet and grew a concerned look. "Where's your mom and dad?" The pair immediately changed their body language and facial expressions, making clearly evident the answer to his question. Jack's face fell immediately as he slowly pulled his grandkids back in for a much more somber embrace. As he held them tight, he stared into the large, late afternoon sun, which slowly materialized into a morning sunrise, just beginning to peek over the Ecuadorian jungle. He regained his emotions as he scanned the Cessna's instruments in front of him. "There it is," he said, while wearing a headset, looking over at Eugene sitting in the co-pilot seat, wearing a similar headset. Eugene looked to where Jack was pointing out the windows and saw a dense jungle with a river flowing through it and a clearing nearby. The flight had taken them nearly half the night. They knew they were in the right area, sometime around 2 in the morning, but were stuck wandering the heavens of the jungle until daybreak, when they would be able to make out a safe place to land. Preferably the airstrip they identified on a map earlier, close to their target that the GPS coordinates had led them to. Eugene looked over at Jack and raised his voice over the Cessna's loud engine. "The clearing next to the river?" he asked. Jack shook his head in agreement and answered, "Yep, that's the Agua Rico River." Eugene gave a half nod while thinking to himself, "I don't see anything. No signs of a refuge, anyway. No structures. No people. No camps. No, nothing." Jack agreed, with a facial expression that said he hoped that Eugene's accurate observations didn't necessarily mean anything. They had to stay positive. The Cessna quickly dropped altitude and began to slow while it straightened itself toward the incoming short landing strip. As it cleared the last of the dense jungle, it made its way to its touchdown at the opening of the dirt strip. Everyone in the plane looked out their windows with concern, as nothing reassuring of a safe harbor came into view. As the Cessna began to sprint down the runway, leaving a plume of dust behind it, the 7 onlookers in the back now peered out the plane's small side windows and noticed their surroundings. An electric fence, grown over with the surrounding wildlife vegetation, stood high and inoperable, with warning signs posted in various locations. Attached to the fence's interior were weathered and broken security cameras. Other than that, within the clearing, they were surrounded by the dense forest. And of course, the small barn-sized concrete building that occupied a small area off in the close distance from the landing strip. The aircraft finally came to a complete stop, shortly before exhausting the runway it had earlier engaged, and the rumbling from the engine began to fade. Soon, a peaceful silence began to take back its hold on the immense area that the group were now displaced in. Soon after touching down, the door of the plane began to open as all 9 passengers began to disembark. Amidst the group stretching, yawning, and rubbing their eyes from the long flight, Trevor pulled out a simple GPS tracking device. This doesn't make any sense. According to the GPS, this is exactly where we're supposed to be. I don't see anything that was described in the broadcast. No grids restored, no secure properties, and definitely no safe fucking harbor. And no sign of Zool, whoever the hell he or she is, Beck added into the list of complaints. Just then, Anne joined the conversation, which was unusual as she was typically a very quiet person. She conversed a lot with her husband, Caleb and Delilah, but was more reserved in the larger group setting. What about that? The group turned to the concrete structure that had a doorway with no door, which led into the dark, empty void inside. Seth joined up with Beck, Trevor, and Eugene at the front line of the group, gazing at the small building. Doesn't seem like much. Doesn't seem like much to me either, Joe stated as he straggled behind the rest, being one of the last to exit the plane. He was closely followed by Jack, making the plane officially vacant. Joe continued, "Surely it doesn't seem like the bargain you guys offered me to turn on an entire army of rogue cartel militants. Safe harbor my ass." With that, Seth walked up to the group's pariah while brandishing a large Bowie knife. "Nobody asked you for your goddamn opinion," he snapped as he raised his weapon to Joe's throat. Joe casually put his arms up while sighing and rolling his eyes. Jack stepped between the two and held Seth back. "This isn't helping anyone," Jack pleaded to Seth. Then, turning to Joe, "You stay quiet." He held a stern glance at Joe, which made him recede into a more respectful posture. Pausing for a moment, before feeling satisfied that he had put Joe back in his place, he turned back to Seth. "I taught you kids everything you know about combat." He looked down to the knife in Seth's hand, then back up into Seth's eyes. "Don't pull it out if you're not planning on using it." Then, Seth, much like Joe, also straightened up to a more respectful demeanor. He gave Joe one final menacing glance, put his knife back under his belt, turned, and walked back over to Beck and Trevor. Trevor, still trying to figure out how they might have ended up in the wrong spot, conjured up his inner caveman and beat his GPS unit on the side a couple times, as if that would do the trick. "Fuck." Seth looked over at him. "It is what it is. Let's at least try to figure out what the hell this place is. There must be some reason why the broadcast announced a precise GPS location leading us all the way into buttfuck Egypt." With that, he began walking toward the seemingly useless concrete hut. Trevor, still angrily looking at the device in his hand, looked up at his friend walking away, then glanced over to Beck and Eugene. "Come on." At that moment, Anne piped up, "I'm gonna hang back with the little ones." Eugene turned around to face her. While walking backwards, maintaining lockstep with his team, he replied, "Sounds good. Doesn't look like much. Shouldn't take too long." With that, he turned and continued on. As the group progressed towards their target, Trevor had a familiar feeling of being watched. He turned his gaze slightly to the right of the concrete shack beyond the defunct electric fence. There, Standing near the start of the jungle, he saw a blurry, dark figure. He couldn't make out specific details, but he felt as if it were staring back at him. For a second, he even swore he felt a vibration coming from the blurred entity. He rubbed his eyes to get a clearer perspective, but by the time he looked back, it had disappeared. Growing tired of these odd events, and frankly becoming quite annoyed by them, he kept quiet of the sighting and didn't bring the matter to anyone's attention. Jack reached into the open door of the plane and pulled out a small blue duffel bag and gave Joe a slight shove. "Let's go give them a hand." Jack and Joe, significantly trailing behind at this point, began to jog in an effort to catch up to the four. Everyone but Joe readied their sidearms as they neared the mysterious structure. Trevor and Seth were first to arrive, closely followed by the rest of them. Jack tossed the duffel bag at Trevor's feet, who then promptly knelt down to open it. He extracted 2 mag lights that were sitting amongst a stockpile of tools, batteries, wires, and other devices they'd collected throughout the years. As he rose back to his feet, he handed Seth a flashlight and kept one to himself. Now, on either side of the door, Trevor and Seth peered into the dark room. They each began to illuminate the entirety of the chamber while they completed a scan of every square inch. Once the two were satisfied, there was no imminent danger. They glanced at each other, nodded, then signaled to the rest to follow as they made their entrance. The team slowly poured in. Seth and Beck began to take the left side of the room while Trevor and Eugene took the right. Jack and Joe remained just outside the building and kept a sharp lookout. As the two pairs carefully scanned the entirety of the room, they each noticed evidence along the walls and floor of an old fire that, by the looks of it, must have taken place long ago. They eventually met up near the center back of the concrete enclosure, where all 4 of them were amazed to see what looked like a top-secret entrance of some kind. It was a large steel door with 2 black metal boxes on either side. The box on the right looked like it once had a small door on it, which was no longer there. Instead, just an open indentation within the box that comprised of buttons with numbers on them, like you would see on an old-fashioned payphone. Each box had a dark piece of glass on the front with thin red lines crisscrossing along their surfaces. They appeared to be some kind of scanners. Trevor and Seth kept their flashlights independently trained on either box. They drew to the conclusion that whatever functionality the box once held, it was mainly to serve the purpose of triggering the large steel door in between them to open. With their newfound knowledge, married with their ever-growing curiosities, Beck whispered to Eugene, "This one's all yours." With that, she put her forefinger and thumb together, placed them in her mouth, and gave a loud whistle to the outside door where Jack and Joe stood guard. Within seconds, the duffel bag, once on the dirt, just outside, made a speedy flight towards the 4 and landed at Eugene's feet. He then knelt down and, with the help of Trevor and Seth, now both pointing their mag lights at the duffel bag, quickly gathered the supplies he required to hack the computer system and hopefully gain entrance to whatever lay behind the daunting steel door. While Eugene went to work on the small boxes, unscrewing the faceplates, exposing a tangled labyrinth of wires and electrical tape, and fastened down computer chips, Beck began to closely examine the door. She felt around for anything, cracks, bumps, breaches, anything to suggest somehow prying open the steel door might be a good plan B should the hacking attempt fail. She carefully traced her hands from top to bottom and from left to right. She felt every edge and corner that met with the flush concrete walls. To her disappointment, nothing felt feasible that would thrust Plan B into motion. As she held her hands flat to the cold steel at the tippy-top center of the slab, the last place she had to inspect, she froze, gave an audible sigh, and let her arms fall back to her sides. Nothing, she thought to herself. She put her hands in her pockets, turned around and leaned on the big steel door. Then, suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, A substantial metal clang sounded from behind her as she threw herself from the now moving steel door. She turned and looked as the door began to open, revealing a dim green light from behind it, and then quickly looked at Eugene in amazement. Eugene, satisfied with his finished project, promptly stood up and threw her a smile and a wink. They all placed their focus on the now exposed space behind the once closed entry and stared in wonder. Even Jack and Joe slowly approached the four from behind in amazement. They soon realized that what they were staring at, this dimly green-lit room with 4 steel walls, was an elevator. Chapter 4, Mirage, Part 2. They all gazed at the elevator, now standing before them, wide open, wondering what on earth it could be for. Beck was the first one to break the silence. Well, fuck that. I'm not going in there. Who knows where that goes? Who knows what'll be on the other side of the door whenever it opens back up? She let out a small, sarcastic laugh and added, if it opens up. Yeah, but think about it. This might lead to the safe harbor the broadcast was telling us about, Trevor said as he tried to calm her fear. She looked at her brother and rolled her eyes. Trev, if the safe harbor is really down there, why on earth would we have to hack our way in? Especially if they're announcing mass invitations over a radio. Trevor looked back at his sister while thinking of a good response to her very, very excellent points. Why do you have to use logic on me? It's such a waste of time. She smiled, crossed her arms, and walked outside. Jack then chimed in. No, this looks like some kind of military-style underground laboratory. He then reached down to the duffel bag and picked up a radio. He handed it to Trevor. Trevor looked at the radio, then back to Jack. Will these even work underground? Jack, while looking at the radio, pointed at it and replied, Son, these things will work anywhere. They're the latest in military technology. They can communicate with each other miles under the earth and completely around it. Trevor nodded. Huh, really? Jack quickly responded. Yep. So long as they're on the same channel. They can even track each other by GPS to one another's precise locations. Just then, Seth joined into the conversation. I'll go with you. Eugene joined in as well. Count me in. Jack reached down to the duffel bag, picked it up, and announced, I've got one back in the plane. It's still set to channel 38, like it has been for weeks. Make sure yours is the same. I'll be listening in. Anything goes wrong, Joe and I will come for you. Right, Joe? Joe sighed and put his hands in his pockets. Sure thing. With that, Jack and Joe turned and walked out of the room to join up with Beck. Alone in the dark room, the three men stared into the perplexing green-lit elevator. Eugene motioned the other two in. Ladies first. Trevor and Seth hesitated for a second, and then walked into the metallic sarcophagus. They turned and looked at Eugene. He quickly did something with the wiring in the black box to the right of the elevator shaft, and then promptly jumped in to join his two friends. The elevator doors slowly closed. They stood there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. They noticed there were lights above that were intended to make the elevator a much brighter space. With power grids down all over the world, this green light must be a more energy-conserving one, powered by a backup generator. A few more seconds went by when they heard the unsettling sounds of chains rattle from behind the walls that surrounded them. The elevator was finally moving and picking up speed rather quickly. Hear me, okay? Over. A crackly sound came from the radio. Trevor turned a knob on the radio, pushed a button, and held it close to his mouth. Yeah, we got you. Over. Back on the surface, by the plane, Jack and Joe were sitting on two camping chairs next to each other, just outside the still open door of the plane, listening to Trevor respond over the radio. Beck, Anne, Caleb, and Delilah were all sitting on a blanket a short distance away, enjoying a little makeshift picnic and playing a kid's card game. Joe proceeded to scan the surroundings beyond the large fences that confined them. He looked into the thick jungle on all sides of them with a suspicious expression that washed over his face. He didn't care for how they were in the open, completely vulnerable to whomever may be watching from the dark, wooded areas. Jack continued the radio dialogue. Keep us updated. I don't want to hear you go dark. We don't want any false alarms. Keep talking. Let us know what you're seeing. We'll be listening. Over. Back in the elevator, Trevor, still with his radio to his mouth and his thumb hovering over the button used to transmit his voice, waited for Jack to finish his instructions. When he heard the word over, he quickly pressed the button to talk. Got it. We're still in the elevator. It's moving really fast, but I think we're okay. It must go down pretty deep. Over. Yeah. These underground military labs can be very deep. Let us know when you hit bottom. Over. A staticky Jack requested. Trevor responded in kind. You got it, old man. Over. Suddenly, the three men's worst-case scenario came speedily true as the elevator's lights began flickering. The three of them stared helplessly at the ceiling as they felt the apparent feeling of the elevator coming loose from its cables. The elevator picked up a much greater speed and began careening down, its shaft being jarred as it slammed into one side of the shaft after another. Eventually, the once perfectly rectangular-shaped metal box began to tweak and take on an entirely different shape as the cement shaft walls began to fold it like an origami. Sparks from the elevator car and the cement walls surrounding it lit up the dark shaft in a dizzying array of orange and yellow light. Eventually, the carriage began to slow as it became wedged between the walls. Inside, the men hunched over and looking upward, kept their eyes out for the ceiling to possibly cave in around them and crush them to death. They felt the friction of the shaft walls assault the exterior walls of the carriage and could feel the interior walls becoming warm, caused by the imposing thermal energy caused by friction. A release of tension filled the cramped air shared by the three as they felt the elevator come to its abrupt and final resting place. The lights continued to flicker as the men began to survey the damage and any possible escape routes. They were all fully aware of the lack of buttons on the elevator walls as they saw them bare upon entering. Upon further inspection now, they began to realize how very bare they actually were. No doors for a control panel, or pickaxe, or even a fire extinguisher to be found. They inspected the ground and ceiling looking for a trapdoor. Houston, we have a problem. Over. Trevor's voice came over the radio. Anne and Beck, sitting nearby, still relaxing with the kids, looked over at Jack holding the radio as their smiles quickly faded. The kids, oblivious to whomever Houston was, continued to play cards. "Go fish," Delilah said with glee in her voice as she looked to her twin. "What seems to be the issue, boys?" "Over," Jack said as he sat up to listen in. Back in the elevator's cabin, Trevor began explaining their dilemma. Everything was sounding smooth with the elevator. Then it sounded like it hit something, causing it to fall off the cables, I think. "It's become badly damaged. The walls are tweaked and caved in," Trevor stated as he looked around with his friends to weigh their options. Just then, Eugene pointed to the corner of the ceiling. There, he noticed a small, thin line protruding from one wall, then making a 90-degree turn and continuing on, ending at the adjacent wall, forming a perfect square, appearing to be the outline of a trapdoor. "Wait, I think we found something. Stand by. Over. See what you can do. Be safe. We're on our way. Over," replied Jack, who now had a greater sense of urgency in his voice that transcended through the radio. As the lights kept flickering, Seth pulled out his mag light and pointed it to the surface of the ceiling, focusing in on the outlining in question. Eugene knelt down by Trevor's side and folded his hands together, creating a cradle for Trevor to stand on. Trevor clipped the radio to his belt, put one foot in Eugene's handcrafted footrest, and used the other to spring himself into the air. As soon as he did that, Eugene stood up, maintaining his partner's foot in his hands, and proceeded to catapult Trevor toward the ceiling. Trevor reached his arm out, extended his fingers on his hand to create a flat palm, and as he closed the distance to the ceiling, he forced the trapdoor's panel wide open. Within the same motion of doing so, he grabbed the edge of the now exposed outer top rim of the cabin and hoisted himself up to the roof. Once atop the elevator car, in the dark elevator shaft, he resituated himself in a laid-down position, with his head and arms dangling through the small square hole. He stretched his arms out and grabbed Eugene's hands as they locked wrists. Eugene was then swiftly pulled up to join his friend. Seth kept his light fixed on the two men carrying out the rescue mission. He watched as Eugene was swept up into the ceiling and disappeared into the dark tunnel to join Trevor. Seconds later, Eugene's face reappeared, dangling his arms through the square hole just as Trevor previously had done. Seth turned off his flashlight and buried it in his back pocket. He threw up his arms and grabbed a hold of Eugene as they too locked wrists. Within seconds, the elevator cabin was left empty, its previous occupants now straddling the roof. There were lights dug into the sides of the cement shaft that glowed green, giving an ominous tint to an already chilling environment. As they gazed to the heavens, the three soon became very aware of how incredibly deep they really were. "Okay, I think we're fine for now. Over," Trevor announced over the radio. The three of them quickly began contemplating their options. Trevor looked over the side of the cabin's roof and was able to peer through a chasm left by the collision between the walls and the elevator. He focused as well as he could and saw the bottom of the shaft somewhere between 2 and 3 stories down. Then he noticed a ladder built into one of the cement walls. He traced the ladder going up the shaft and noticed that it had sustained severe damage, making it too risky to scale. He signaled to the other two his findings as he began speaking into the radio once again. "We got about 2, maybe 3 stories left to hit bottom, and there's a ladder embedded in one of the shaft walls. It's way too far up to travel by the ladder now. Besides, the ladder itself has taken on significant damage. We're going down. We will radio you as soon as we hit bottom. Over." As Trevor clipped the radio back on his belt, Jack sounded a response, shrouded in static. "Sounds like a plan. We'll start workshopping some ideas from up here to help you get back up. In the meantime, get the hell away from that elevator. It's a potential death trap. Over." Realizing the excellent point coming from the other end of the radio, the three moved with urgency as they made their way, one by one, to the ladder. The ladder had been welded into the wall, giving them ample space to clear the elevator car. One above the other, they started making their descent. Eugene at the bottom, then Trevor, followed by Seth. About a quarter way there, the ladder shifted from being welded into the wall and carved into it to a metal-style ladder, scaling the interior of the shaft itself. Eventually, within moments, they were halfway there. Suddenly, they heard a metallic rumbling from above that sounded all too familiar and was a very unwelcome sound to their ears. They all froze and looked up at the same time. Silence. Then again, the rumbling sound, except this time they witnessed the source of the sound firsthand. The elevator was moving, slowly becoming unwedged as the mechanics to the cables kept trying to do its job, attempting to move the cabin. It quickly surrounded the three in dire straits. "Move," Seth yelled. The three began to rapidly pick up their pace, trying to outrun the Hulk-like object soon to be pursuing them. They only had about 30 feet, a little less than 2 stories to travel. Then 25 feet left to go. Then 20 feet. And then it happened. The metal box above them was freed by the trusty elevator mechanics and began to free fall. Each one of the men held on to the ladder loosely with their hands, placed their feet outside the vertical rails, and slid the rest of the way down. With sounds of absolute chaos from above, only getting louder as the behemoth became closer, the three hit bottom, one by one. First, Eugene, landing in such a way he lost his balance and was propelled backwards through the doorless doorframe, thrusting him into the underground lab. Then Trevor came next. He hit bottom, but was going too fast to stop himself and fell flat onto the cold stone ground. Lastly, Seth scaled down, hit the ground, and like the other two was floored by his speedy entrance. Laying on the floor of the elevator shaft, Seth looked up to see the carriage had nearly caught up to the team, preparing to completely flatten him altogether. Paralyzed with fear upon seeing the impending crisis closing in on him from above, Seth closed his eyes tight and put his hands and arms up toward the rogue elevator car, now on a collision course with his own body. Just then, as the elevator slammed into the ground, a large cloud of dust filled the dimly green-lit room. As the dust settled, Eugene and Trevor lay in hunched-over positions, heavily breathing, each clutching their friend Seth by an underarm after dragging him to safety. While clutching his friend on the ground, Trevor peered over to a blackened, burnt door. On it was fastened a sign singed around the edges. As the words came into focus, he read, ZUL, Zancudo Underground Laboratory, Safe Harbor Software, Safe Harbor Inc., Network Power Grid Access. Trevor studied the sign, momentarily losing awareness of the quagmire compounding the three, and reflected with an echoed mind, sounding the first 3 letters out. Z-U-L. Sool. Fuck. After the dust settled, the 3 began regrouping. They each felt utter despair when they saw the pile of rubble that used to be the carriage they once stood in completely block their only way out. Shit, Trevor cried out. Shit, shit, shit. Seth looked over at him. What? The radio. It's gone. It must have fallen off me when I hit the ground. Already realizing that they were in very bad shape, miles below the surface, this last development of being completely cut off from the only help they could count on sent them into panic mode. Pure fear began setting in as the air in the underground laboratory soon grew thick with tension. At the surface level, in the dark concrete structure, outside the closed steel elevator door, a worried group tried communicating by radio to their absent team, who now lay helplessly buried miles below the surface. Jack wasn't giving up. He kept on trying to get a response from the other end of the radio. Trevor, do you read me? Seth? Eugene? Trevor? Come in, someone. Do you read me? Meanwhile, on a vacant corner near the sandy beaches of the town of Esmeralda, a hand reached into a very familiar garbage dumpster, then pulled out a very familiar radio. It was 2 Beltran Leyva foot soldiers. The man that pulled the radio out heard a very faint voice coming from it. He studied the radio for a second, then turned a knob to increase the volume. He had turned it all the way up to hear the voice on the other end. From the radio he heard, Trevor, do you read me? Seth, Eugene, Trevor, come in, someone. Do you read me? Over. He immediately turned to his fellow soldier, handed him the radio and voiced his orders in Spanish. Inform the Chancellor at once. Chapter 5. Consciousness. It had been over 5 years since the nuclear crisis took place. Thomas and Seth, after discovering that they were the only ones left of their family, settled down in the town of Quartzsite and became good friends with the Meeks family. This behooved them, as Jack, being a former high-ranking officer in the Navy, had a vast arsenal of weaponry and other various militaristic devices. The ranch was also well-equipped with food, water, supplies, and a powerful backup generator suited for his bunker and charging his diversified collection of hardware for up to 20 years. Having said that, one does not need a mathematician to conclude that with the additional roommates, time with these luxury items would soon come to an end. Jack, having devoted most of his adult life to the military, spent the last several years training the four in weaponry and hand-to-hand combat. With his expertise on the government and with state-of-the-art communication devices at his disposal, they stayed abreast of the world around them. as they began to see the thinned US military become overwhelmed by the Russian insurgents and the Mexican cartels. They came to grips with the reality of the increasingly violent world that America was becoming. There was something going on between the Russians and the cartels. Tensions flew high between the two. Although they seemed to hold a high level of animosity towards each other, they seemed to share a common goal: human trafficking. It wasn't clear to anyone who was benefiting from whom. All anyone knew was, when it came to the trade, the two worked closely together, hand in hand. This spurred the five to want to stick together and guard each other's backs. The four amateurs trained with Jack constantly. They trained in various military combat and were becoming very good at it. They had built themselves a very comfortable but lonely little community. The group all lived in Jack's farmhouse and took shifts keeping guard and completing supply runs. They were becoming a great team and worked well together. Over the years, the five became inseparable. The typical transient foraging for supplies slipped in and out of the town, but nothing thus far posed any threat to the well-defended family. There wasn't much Russian or cartel activity either in their sleepy little community. But that was beginning to change. They started noticing caravans of military vehicles traverse their surrounding offbeat roads and began to execute a more inconspicuous approach in their daily habits. The five began to do their supply runs under the cover of darkness. They established a stealthier approach at keeping guard over their property. They didn't have bonfires at night anymore and kept their extracurricular activities to a minimum. They became ghosts. They played it safe. They knew they could hold their own, but that didn't mean picking fights with large militarized insurgents or bloodthirsty kingpins. So, with this newly developed strategy, they gave themselves the best chance of survival. Still though, accidents do happen. In the dusty little abandoned town of La Paz, about 8 miles south of Quartzsite, Thomas and Seth were laying belly down on the roof of Gus's drive-through liquor. It was bright and sunny out, and not a cloud in the sky. They each held binoculars to their eyes and were peering over the 1-foot lip that crowned the rundown venue. Gus's liquor stood on an almost empty road. Once upon a time, this small brick building possessed prime real estate for catering to the weary worker wishing to dive into a glass bottle before calling it a night. Thomas, still peering through his binoculars, while next to his son, took his face away from them, stared blankly into the distance in front of him as he thought to himself. Then, he turned to Seth and asked, "So if something happens to me, or we all become separated?" But then, Seth stopped his dad while interrupting with an already prepared answer to his father's question, and answered in a tone of boredom. "Yes, Dad, I go and find Paco." Satisfied with a nod of his head, his dad went back to studying whatever it was they were watching through his binoculars. Then, once more, Thomas removed himself from the binoculars and again stared blankly into the distance as he thought to himself. He turned to Seth, but without even getting a word out, Seth was on top of it. "Yes, Dad," he said, while maintaining his focus on their target. Rio Baru Port, Dominical Beach, Costa Rica, like clockwork, at sunset on the 1st of every month. His dad smirked this time as he went back to join his son watching their objective. While still looking through the binoculars, Seth effortlessly composed a question. "We haven't seen Paco in years. How do you know he'll be there?" Thomas smiled. "He'll be there." "Okay, we got movement," Thomas calmly announced. They were now observing a small, dilapidated, abandoned warehouse across the street. In consort, 3 military-grade Hummers pulled up to the curb. 2 men in Russian military uniforms stepped out of each of them, their military boots all making contact with the asphalt below at the same time. It happened in an almost rehearsed, coordinated arrangement as they all came to one particular spot. The four from the two cars in the back approached the two that got out of the car in the front. The soldiers were all carrying rifles. They exchanged a few words in Russian and then opened the rear doors of the first Hummer. 3 people stumbled out. While hopping about, it was obvious they had been handcuffed and shackled. There was an older man and woman, then a young female standing behind them out of Thomas and Seth's view. As Seth and Thomas looked on in anticipation, they were eventually able to identify the female as the 3 were being motioned to begin walking. It was Beck. Thomas immediately voiced, "Got her." He then watched as they escorted the prisoners into the warehouse. There were 6 men altogether. 2 went inside with their hostages, and the other 4 stood guard by the doors, about 200 feet from where they had parked. Thomas lifted his head along with Seth, and they looked at each other. "You remember the plan?" Seth gave his dad a quick nod, and they both lowered flat to the ground and began army crawling backwards along the small rooftop. On the opposite side, at the rear of the building, they came to the ladder they had originally climbed to gain access to the roof. The ladder was fixed to the back of the building and led down to the pavement. They each shimmied over the ledge and down the ladder to the ground, Seth ahead of his father. Upon reaching the ground, Seth quietly opened and slid a large, heavy sewer cap from its place. Once completely open, he began to disappear down the dark hole. Meanwhile, Thomas carefully got into a very old, beat-up yellow Toyota Camry. The car was already running. They left it that way so they wouldn't have to start it up and bring any unwanted attention to themselves. He began to slowly drive off through an alleyway, keeping out of sight of their counterparts. A few moments later, another sewer cap began to move on its own, this time under the first parked Hummer. It was the only Hummer with a bed in the back. Once fully open, Seth slowly crawled from the hole. As he wiggled on his back across the beat-up and chipped asphalt, he made his way to the driver's side, opposite the armed Russians. He hefted himself up by first using the footrails of the massive vehicle. Then slowly reaching above, he gripped the open window's lower frame, ultimately scaling the entire side of the vehicle. Eventually, he found himself spilling into the driver's seat's black leather upholstery through the rolled-down opening. Once inside, hearing the sound of the vehicle's engine already running, he looked at the keys in the steering column with dismay. Damn, I really wanted to try my hand at wiring one of these, he thought to himself. He placed his foot on the brake pedal and grabbed a hold of the steering wheel, taking a moment to enjoy the pure bliss of sitting in the driver's seat that commanded the 300-horse-powered monstrosity. He could barely hear the voices of the nearby Russians as they continued to obliviously carry on in conversation. Then, taking hold of the oversized shifter, he slid the powerful beast into neutral and revved the engine as loud as he could. The 4 exterior warehouse guards looked over at the truck, confused and shocked. Their postures shifted and their conversation became silent. Seth placed the vehicle into drive and made a piercing sound as he screeched out a sharp U-turn, kicking up a large fog of dust and dirt in the process. Now, his window, on the side where the caught-off guards were once casually speaking, he quickly achieved their surprised attention. With an extended left arm and middle finger reaching out the window, mocking the soldiers, he proceeded to speed off around the corner. "Later, fuckers," he yelled, tempting them to give chase. The 4 armed men in uniform began yelling in Russian as they ran down the parking lot to the street. They aimed their rifles and began firing, but soon realized their repossessed vehicle had already made its way around the corner. Listening to the direction the sounds were telling them to go, the men gathered a Hummer of their own and took off in pursuit. With surprising ease, the men chased down their enemy and soon found their lost item sitting on the steps of a church. Once parked behind their stolen vehicle, all four men quickly made their way out of their Hummer and surrounded the recovered car. They immediately discovered that no one was inside. All four began spinning their bodies and scanning the area, seeming to all draw their focus at the same time to the partially opened door of the church. They aimed their guns at the open door in front of them and began barking orders in Russian. As they made their way inside, they picked up a faint smell of gasoline. Looking at each other, the ranking officer signaled for the group to push on. The entry room was torn to shreds from previous lootings. It had thrashed, stained, red carpet, and white walls. As they moved their way through the meagerly sized foyer, they cautiously walked up to a set of double doors, which were slightly left open, leading to the chapel. A voice from within the chapel shouted, "You get your car back, assholes!" Not understanding the English words coming from inside in the room, they all recognized the voice from the thief that mocked them from before, while driving away in their Hummer. They slowly made their way in, guns drawn. The room was dark, with rays of light beaming through the boarded-up stained glass windows. Nothing about this seemed out of place to the men. They were used to no electricity, and this whole town was abandoned. What was out of place was the increasingly growing scent of gasoline. As they made their way into the room, toward the direction that they had heard the voice, they dutifully checked corners and the walls receding behind them. As they walked, sounds of broken glass and debris from under their boots filled the stuffy air. There were about 40 pews, 20 to either side of them, some knocked over, while some were out of sync with the rest. Soon, something caught their attention between the pews and near the steps leading to the pulpit. They trained their weapons on the object and advanced their positions while commanding orders in Russian. As they came up to the void, they saw the image come into focus. It was a large metal barrel. On top was a radio. The ranking officer picked up the device and flinched as a loud, crackly voice came over it.
Haven't fought, dickheads.
Still not understanding anything the voice was saying, the realization of a trap began to sink in and washed over their vacant expressions as they identified another object on the barrel. A car battery with wires coming out of it, leading to a hole inside the lid of the metal container. They quickly turned around and began to race for the door. The open double doors seemed to magically slam on their own, followed by the metallic sounds of several deadbolts taking their places from within. Then, without warning, several Molotov cocktails crashed through the glass and through the small breaches of the boarding. The men looked on in horror as the room became engulfed in flames, ending in a blast providing a short rain of sand, ember, wood, and blood. Meanwhile, Jack and Trevor walked up to the now unguarded warehouse doors armed with small pistols. Jack looked at Trevor. "Ready?" Trevor nodded. Jack then pounded on the large metal sliding door. He then yelled in Russian with an impressive Russian accent, attempting to gain the attention of the hostage takers within the building. Then he stood back and let Trevor handle the next step. Immediately, the door to the warehouse slid open. Trevor yanked the man by the collar underneath his chin as Jack disarmed him of his weapon. Trevor swiftly changed his grip on the man from the man's collar to his arm, spun the man around and held his arm in a painful position high up his back behind him. Trevor then walked the man in, using his arm to steer him and his body as a human shield while pointing his pistol at the soldier's temple. Trevor knew he had to stay focused on the task at hand, but he couldn't shake the urge to look for his missing sister. He momentarily took his eyes off the man he was walking toward, who was yelling at Trevor in Russian. It wasn't a big warehouse, about the size of a 3-car garage. Gray cement flooring spread throughout the structure, coalescing with the thin aluminum sidings. There was not much in the warehouse, a few tables, some bar stools and whatnot. It was, however, well lit from the decrepit rooftop, allowing plenty of light to flow through, casting shadows along the walls and deep corners. The soldier across the room, once sitting on a chair next to a table monitoring a radio and still armed, was now standing, the chair he'd used knocked over behind him. He had his gun, which he had immediately taken off the table in front of him, upon noticing his abrupt threat, now pointed at his comrade, who was in the way of Trevor, his real target. But all he could see was Trevor's face, as Trevor strategically stayed behind his life like shield. The soldiers were both yelling in Russian, most likely ordering Trevor to surrender. He watched and kept his aim as Trevor kept advancing. Just then, he saw a man appear from behind Trevor. It was Jack. Then, this serious newcomer suddenly raised a small pistol from behind Trevor's back and shot a fire before he could react. As 2 gunshots sounded, a bullet went straight through his forehead as the man crashed to his knees and tumbled face first into the concrete floor. Almost at the same time, Trevor also dispatched his weapon, dropping the limp body from his clutches. With both men now fatally subdued, Trevor and Jack immediately scanned the room and found Beck lying on her stomach, hog-tied and muzzled, in between the other 2 prisoners. They were near the back of the warehouse in a dark corner. The pair of rescuers immediately liberated the 3 by cutting loose their bonds. Beck sprung into a hug with her grandfather. Later that evening, the reunited group drove through the dark summer's cooling heat. They were now heading north, back toward home. Seth, happily at the wheel, paid little attention to anything or anyone else, absorbing the emotions the truck incurred upon his male hormones. He made his turn onto the highway with his father at his side and had the look of utter enjoyment written across his face. In the back, a very relieved Gramps and brother sit close to Beck as they did their best to sensitively balance emotional support with interrogation. Then, Beck turned her head and peered into the seats behind her. "So, what's your names?" One of the other 2 rescued hostages spoke up with a little hesitation. "My name's Eugene. This is my wife, Anne." Anne and Beck began to laugh while sitting next to Delilah and Caleb amongst their modest picnic spread. The story of Beck's rescue mission and the fortunate events leading up to Eugene and Anne's freedom had always delighted the group. But no one told it the way Jack could. He always made everyone laugh when he described how Seth mocked the kidnappers. Joe didn't really get it as he sat next to Jack, staring resentfully into the distance. He was still annoyed at his unfortunate side of the so-called bargain the team had made with him. Delilah and Caleb didn't seem to care much either. Now was the time to focus on the real issues at hand, collecting the largest set of 4 in their card game. A lull came over the group's discussion as they reminisced upon old survival stories. Anne's smile faded softly. "I just wish we knew how they traced us back to your house. When we found Thomas the next morning, after his shift to keep watch." Her face grimaced as she could still vividly see Thomas hanging from the awning of the back porch, his stomach split open and his entrails splattered across the deck below him. The Arizona sunrise, glowing behind him, creating an eerie juxtaposition. "I just don't get it. We never saw anyone follow us. Seth's never been the same since." "Of course, I don't blame him," Jack responded while pausing in thought. "You want to know something I still don't get? Why the hell didn't they finish us all off? At least we found Kent and his friends. Their brilliant plan with that gasoline generator really got us hell and gone from there. We were lucky that night for some strange reason, but I'm positive we were next on their shit-to-do list." Beck then added to the conversation, "I just wish we never heard that stupid broadcast. Fuck this place." Jack and Anne smiled in response. Then suddenly, a voice came over the radio that Jack was holding casually in his lap. It was Trevor. It was the first they'd heard from him since he descended down the elevator with Seth and Eugene. And unfortunately, he didn't have good news. He sounded rattled and spoke with a sense of hesitation, yet urgency. Houston, we have a problem. Over. Chapter 5, Consciousness, Part 2. Miles underground, after the dust had settled, the three rushed over to the rubble that should have been their return trip awaiting them, preferably in better condition. There were large, jagged pieces of cement, which used to be the shaft's interior, that the elevator had forced down underneath it, laying before them. On top of the debris sat a defunct carriage that didn't even have the will to flicker green from inside any longer. The fragmented cabin that was once occupied by the three was now crushed beyond recognition. It wasn't even able to be breached through its entry. Before meeting its demise, the doors were completely shut. But now, from the intense collision, they were slightly open. Just above the cabin, as well as underneath, messy layers of more and more concrete lay wedged between each other and the elevator. The underground team tried pulling, pushing, and prying the collection of broken matter to no avail. They desperately tried, reaching through cracks and crevasses throughout the mire, attempting to place their third sense on anything remotely feeling like their missing radio. A slow descent of the impromptu mission began to take place as Seth started to observe the rest of the room that they were in. His focus was drawn to a large dome-like ceiling. Centered directly underneath was a large steel cage with curtains lining the inside partially open in the front. They had dark brown, splashy stains all over them. As he began walking towards it, compelled by pure curiosity, he suddenly realized the remains of a human body along the way. It was all skeleton, clothed in what appeared to be a tattered hazmat suit. Near the body's head sat an open briefcase with an open laptop and a darkened screen inside of it. This obviously wasn't his plan, Eugene said. He had walked up behind him while he was focused in on the lifeless figure. Seth turned his head slightly toward Eugene, without shifting his eyes from the deceased human. "There's two more in that cage over there." Eugene looked up to where Seth was lazily pointing. Sure enough, just beyond the open cage lay two more bodies bereft of life. They were also in tattered and tarnished hazmat-like suits. "What the fuck happened down here?" Trevor said, joining his two buddies, both contemplating scenarios of the long-ago occurrence. They stood there for a moment, letting the eerie display carnage beg questions. What really went on here? They thought to themselves. Is it the room that killed them? There were no weapons, or a sign that they turned on one another. Could they soon share the same fate of their three lifeless roommates? "We gotta figure a way out of here. We obviously can't communicate with the rest of our group anymore. We need to spread out, see what we can find. Maybe there's another elevator or something." "That door over there might be a good start," Seth announced, as he drew the other two's attention toward a burnt door that appeared to be a shade of gray at one time. The three, completely forgetting the resourceful tip of splitting up, mentioned by Trevor just a second ago, slowly approached the door. Seth continued to talk. "So much for a safe harbor. Says here, Safe Harbor Software. A software company. We tracked down a fucking software company." The thought crossed each of their minds, but was immediately and unanimously blocked out due to the array of dark threats the thought was accompanied by. Why? Oh, why would anyone lure a group of people all the way into the jungles of South America? Some unwelcomed conclusions flashed in their heads as a much-needed distraction came about. "Zonkudo Underground Laboratory," Trevor said while reading the sign he had seen earlier aloud, while letting out an annoyed sigh. "And there's our Azul." The three came up to the door. It had a regular doorknob on it that clearly was able to be locked. The three hesitated for a second as Eugene looked over at his companions. "Should we knock?" Trevor looked back at him with a crooked expression and a frown as if to say that his humor wasn't comforting. Eugene smiled and shrugged while looking at Seth, who was just shaking his head in disappointment with a sarcastic smile. Trevor reached forward and grabbed the handle. He closed his eyes as if that would give him a better chance. He slowly turned it until they heard the inner battery assembly click into place. He looked back at the two with raised eyebrows. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Having no weapons, they were all beginning to feel a sense of unease as a very dark room began to introduce itself. Finally, after all the complaining through its slow, creaky sounds, the door stood completely wide open, only leaving them inches from the borders of the unknown. A soft humming sound slightly echoed through the curious darkness, while the tiniest of red and green lights pulsated off into the distance. Eugene reached in and felt along the wall directly inside for a switch until the entire room lit up all at once. The room wasn't that big, about the size of a large walk-in closet or small bedroom. The walls and ground maintained the same decor as the surrounding laboratory that dwarfed it. Alongside the opposite side of the room was a towering shelving unit that facilitated a few large computer towers, several keyboards, a mouse, and finally, a flat computer screen monitor. Do I even have to say anything? Trevor looked over at Eugene. Eugene looked back at the two. You guys really need to learn this shit. Trevor shrugged his shoulders. We have all the time in the world now. It had been about 5 long hours now, without any word from below. Beck, along with Jack and Joe, could not even get the steel door open to survey the damage below. The wiring inside the black boxes to either side of the door spoke a foreign language to the three. This is where Eugene could really come in handy, but irony had him miles below instead. They had tried for hours to contact them by radio, and were slowly losing hope. They had no idea if the 3 men beneath were even alive anymore. If they were they hurt? And if so, how bad? Did they make it to an opening? Were they at least able to stumble across some supplies? Without getting an answer over the radio for so long now, these questions kept persisting conclusions that drove Beck, Anne, and Jack insane. The entire surfaced party were now all inside the concrete structure, including the little ones. Jack was still fussing with the radio, seeing if maybe Trevor had inadvertently changed channels. Beck was trying her hardest to understand the wiring in the box, while Joe kept a steady light for her, illuminating her workspace. They had all agreed that the kids would be safest right now inside the enclosure, while all the adults were putting their heads together, brainstorming as best they could. Caleb and Delilah were left to their imaginations, sitting quietly, facing each other, whispering war plots towards one another as they played on the sandy concrete flooring. They were at the feet of one of their many parental figures, Anne. She was watching Jack and Beck with the terrified thoughts of what may have become of her husband burrowing their way through her head. Anne heard it first. Was that the sound of helicopter blades? It was the slightest sound, but she definitely heard something. Shh. She immediately signaled to the kids playing while also receiving an audience from the other adults inside. Does anyone else hear that? Jack and Beck looked at each other. Shit, was Anne losing her mind? Jack thought to himself. But then, slowly he saw Beck's expression change. Then he looked to Joe, and sure enough, he was hearing something as well. Jack still was at a loss as he asked, "What is it?" Then he heard it too. The 4 adults ran out of the covering and all formed a line parallel to the open door behind them. They squinted as they looked up in the sky, their hands shielding their eyes from the bright skies. "There!" Joe yelled as he pointed. Sure enough, it was a helicopter. It was quite a way off into the distance, but appeared to be heading towards them. Joe looked over at Jack, who still had his head to the sky. With a much quieter voice, he composed his question. Expecting anyone? All the while, about 2 miles under the aerial sighting, a drama was still unfolding. Eugene was standing at the black and green computer screen while moving the mouse and typing code into the system's hardware. There were no chairs. Instead, they all stood while Eugene hacked away. See this here? That's the firewall. You're actually looking at code that monitors the system's entire security apparatus. I haven't actually broken into the system. The US government firewall is way too strong for that. Instead, by extrapolating these codes here, I borrowed the algorithm and created one of my own. I basically bent the code in our direction, giving us limited access to the software. Now we just need a username. Eugene looked at the two. They both looked back at him, with an expression that seemed to suggest they were in no mood to come up with some stupid username on the spot. Eugene continued to type as he spoke out loud. Okay. G-U-E-S-T. Then he hit enter. The computer screen went to a bright white screen with a square in the center. Inside the square read, "Welcome to Zool. Safe Harbor Software. This U.S. government system is intended for authorized users only. Then, underneath that was the warning defined in a much more legal manner, pointing to laws and federal codes. Underneath the box was a button that read Enter. Eugene clicked on it to find the page go to a dizzying screen of laboratory records. He scanned down until happening upon an interesting title that read Last Security Footage, 2033, March 9th. He clicked on it, and the entire screen went black. The three of them stared as nothing seemed to happen for several seconds. To make things worse, the computer sounded as though it had turned off. "What the hell?" Eugene stated, with confusion in his breath. He turned to Seth and Trevor. "That's weird. I should have access to anything that I can see on the screen. We may have to reboot the system." Just then, a video began to play before them. They watched a whole long portion of nothing, just the view of an empty lab. The cage in the center, unlike what they saw for themselves just earlier, was closed by clean, white hanging curtains. Then they saw 3 people enter the screen in white hazmat suits. Eugene hit the fast-forward button, skimming to anything that might help them better understand why the 3 people had met the tragic fate displayed outside the room they were standing in. "There!" exclaimed Seth. Eugene stopped fast-forwarding by pressing play. The 3 looked on in horror as they saw the blood-curdling images flash before their eyes. No sound came from the video, which somehow intensified the playback in a horrifying manner. Eugene stayed hunched over the screen, watching closely, while Seth leaned in right next to him. Trevor was slowly backing up, clutching the hair of his scalp with his hands. The video finally came to an end. Eugene and Seth looked over at each other, then back at Trevor, who was clearly rattled as he began speaking quickly. "We gotta get the fuck out of here. What if that thing's still in here? What if it's still alive? Hold on a sec. I think I found something," Eugene said. He was back on the white screen, scrolling down the list of laboratory records. He clicked on a button that read Laboratory Log, Specimen 762854, 2032, October 21st. Again, the computer appeared as though it had turned off. This time, knowing what to expect, they held their focus on the computer. A man's face finally appeared, just his face. He was standing in the room they were currently in. "Only many years ago." He was silent as he appeared to be fumbling with something. Then, there was sound. He continued to mess around with something on the shelf next to the monitor he was facing, stopped inside, then began to speak. "This is Salvador Philip Channing. The date is October 21st, 2032. Time is 1452 hours, he stated while momentarily glancing at his watch. "This is my 7th time observing this specimen." He continued to speak with nervous unease of the things he had to share. "We have concluded that the specimen's genome is comprised of 172 DNA molecules. The human body only has 46. While the complexity of their DNA is vastly greater than ours, it seems to be the least alarming aspect. Their brain from frontal lobe to the cerebellum measures roughly 37 centimeters, while ours averages about 15. Furthermore, upon several magnetic resonance imaging tests, it is found to use 97% of its entire brain's capacity. Through several tests, we have qualified the specimen to possess abilities such as, but not limited to, telepathy, levitation, localized teleportation, and instantaneous metamorphosis. However, the specimen is extremely weakened and cannot perform these abilities to their fullest extent. Several days ago, we were finally able to achieve communication with our subject through a variation of mathematical code, letter by letter. We were not able to get clear, precise answers from it, but we were able to make out a few Russian words. For instance, In the case of entry log 2032, October 13th, we asked if there were any others on our planet. Its response put us completely at a loss. Its answer was completely off topic. It appeared to make no sense at all. Perhaps this is due to onset disorientation, possibly caused by pyrexia. Then again, without access to a substantial control group, we are not able to adequately establish guidelines as to what may qualify as a high fever for its species. The answer was simply Ocranus scotus. In English, this translates to cattle guards. Now, this does make some sense, if, indeed, pyrexia does play a role. It may simply be hallucinating images from its past experiences on our planet. For example, the site it was originally apprehended in was surrounded by Russian farmland. There were surely plenty of posted signs there, which it could have easily obtained those words from. We are still undergoing early phases of tests to find out more about the virus, although we do have clues leading us to the educated theories. Theory number 1 is that they came here with the virus. Maybe they're here in search of a cure. Oftentimes with unknown viruses, it behooves oneself to scan the heavens. A distant rock can often hold elements to unlocking useful tools to combat microscopic invaders. Our second theory suggests a much darker premise. The specimen became ill here on our planet through gestation. This theory examines a dilemma we hope not have to overcome. Upon our investigation of the originating site of Petrovka, there were absolutely no human bodies found. At the same time, nearly hundreds were wiped out. As outlandish as it may seem, we believe it is worth looking into the minute possibility that static came over the computer as the lights in the entire facility began to flicker. I think the computers are bogging down the generator, Eugene said, as he looked to the other two. With a few buttons on the keyboard and a click of the mouse, the screen returned to its black and green layout as he logged out of the Zool mainframe. At that moment, all the lights in the facility stabilized, but presented a slightly dimmer shine. We don't have much time before the power completely goes out, and we may begin to lose air down here, Eugene said, alarming his two friends. Trevor's right. We need to spread out and see if we can find a backup route. Hold up, Seth interrupted with a stern voice. What do you mean? Air. Eugene looked at his younger partners, noticing their disconcerted expressions, now taking hold of their faces. You guys realize we're, like, miles underground, don't you? There has to be some kind of compression unit, drawing oxygen this far down. Wherever this system is, I'm sure it's not powered by Skittles. An immediate look of logic defeated Seth and Trevor's once confused expressions. The two, along with Eugene, began twisting and turning their bodies around. They were all peering into the corners of the small room they were in, as well as the cavernous room that resided just beyond it. Trevor and Eugene began briskly walking out of the computer repository to survey their options in the main room. But Seth did not. Instead, he held a gaze below the computer they were once occupying. Then he attempted to gain the attention of his two partners. Hey, guys, Trevor and Eugene, frantically eyeballing the larger room, unintentionally ignored their would-be cellmate. Seth, still focused on his new mysterious finding, tried beckoning his buddies once more. Hey, guys, check this out. I think I've got something. Trevor and Eugene shared glances, as if developing a telepathic ability of their own. Without parsing words, shared the same thought. What on earth could be so important in there? We saw every inch of the room. Not much to see. Still, the two immediately doubled back as requested. They met Seth on either side of him, designing a shoulder-to-shoulder assembly. Their minds raced as they laid their eyes on Seth's potential jackpot. Just underneath the tall shelving unit on the ground, barely exposing itself to the three aspiring escapists, was a separation in the flooring parallel to the unit. On each end, the separation angled 90 degrees and crept under the lowest ledge, apparently continuing on to form a square. Could this be a tunnel? Without even exchanging ideas of any semblance of a plan, they all began rearranging the cramped computer room to emancipate the possible exit. Once they removed enough weight, through carelessly removing items from the shelves, they slid the unit aside. Sure enough, it was something. In the dead center of the square slab, separated from the rest of the concrete flooring, was a handle. On the opposite end, nearest the wall, were what appeared to be hinges, embedded along the furthest crevice. The three looked on in hopeful shock. Trevor hurriedly bent over, grabbed the handle and began to pull. He grunted at the weight, but slowly built a gap between the closest side of the lid and the floor. Upon the sight of freedom, Seth and Eugene dropped to their knees, slid their fingers between the gap, and proceeded to assist their teammate. Now, all three began to grunt. Eventually, the lid started opening much faster, until finally it came to a loud slamming, resting place against the stone wall behind it. They peered into a dingy, musty, dark hole. It didn't have any stairs and was absent of a ladder. They could see with the provided light above, from the space they were currently standing in, just barely, the hint of ground below. It seemed to be about 4, maybe 5 feet down. The three shared glances, and after slight hesitation, all agreed this was their best option. One after the other, they slipped into the depths below, not the slightest clue of what the near future would provide them with. First went Trevor, then Seth, and finally Eugene. There was a slight tumble, but nothing to shake their nerves over. The room was dark, but clearly made of the similar cement material, matching the rest of the superstructure. It was very cold, and a musty smell lay thick, permeating the tight atmosphere. Eugene hit the ground, landing just behind Seth, who was turned away from him, but facing back with a celebratory look. Eugene's gaze moved from Seth's face to the back of Trevor's head, and then, finally, beyond the two, to a dimly lit end with a red ladder ascending beyond their sights. They simultaneously raced forward, paying no attention to how silly 3 grown men looked, trying to run while crouching down a dark, small hallway. They didn't even fight the stupid-looking grins growing across their faces as they approached the ladder towards the end. In a single file, but not so orderly way, they reached their goal. The team were finally able to stand, fully erect, and observe the discovered riser room. The three were immediately overwhelmed with the amazing sight that unfolded overhead. The vertical hole was about 10 feet wide. The ladder was positioned in the dead center, not contacting the ground. Instead, at consistent, ascending intervals, it was attached to the interior cement siding with steel braces. At each one of these intervals were safety ledges, wide enough for one to rest. Each was paired with a familiar green glow of lights, fixed to the walls, just above each ledge. With just the little bit of light, they could see the daunting task that lay before them. Unable to see the ladder's end, it was still enough to see the immense distance the stairs traveled before receding into the shadows. Unable to refrain from laughing with each other, while exchanging a few fist bumps, not seconds passed before they began to make their journey up. "I can't wait to get to the top," one of them cried out while they climbed their first leg. The three began to gleefully conversate as they made their way to freedom. "I'm gonna drink a gallon of water. Good luck. There's not gonna be any left by the time I'm done drinking. I just can't wait to see some fucking sunlight. I wonder where this comes out. Should be just behind the entrance to the elevator. Stupid piece of shit elevator. Hey, it was worth it though. Can't wait to see the look on Jack's face when we tell him about specimen 265, whatever the fuck the numbers were. He's gonna flip his shit. Hey, We should scare the shit out of them when we get up there. Sneak up on them. The three began to laugh, imagining the thought of scaring their surfaced friends as their voices began to fade. They each began to disappear, one by one, into the darkness of the underground heavens. Little by little, the cement landing slowly became empty and silent, with no evidence of any human life. Several hours later, the morning skies had morphed into a bright, sunny, late afternoon. Within the shadows, cast by a familiar cement structure, sprawling fauna flourished in an array of mixed vegetation and weeds. A small, shadowy patch of nature suddenly came alive, as if, from a disturbance from underneath its soil, an unnatural motion overtook the grassy area. Soon, a distinctly circular mixture of dirt and plants began to shift upward as a metal lid began to take form. A hand began to appear, shortly followed by Trevor's squinted face. Although protected by the shade of the elevator's home, the bright sky still heavily affected his ability to see. He began to heft himself up and over the side of the deep well. He then scooted back on his rear and withdrew his legs and doubled over the hole, offering a hand to the next in line. Seth threw up his hand and caught Trevor's as the two pulled on each other, rushing Seth to the surface. They both then turned around and helped Eugene complete his ascent. The three stood in a circle, at least the best circle three could make, triumphantly looking down into the dark, conquered void. Again, they smiled at each other and proceeded to seek a well-deserved reunion with their friends. They began to walk, making their way around the corner of the small building. They assumed that their estranged companions were still seeking tactics of rescue within the structure itself. Not knowing the reactions of their soon-to-be surprised friends, they all reserved a proud smile. It was Trevor who saw it first. Joe was laying on the ground, about 30 feet from where the escaped three were appearing from. He knew what he was seeing. He just didn't want to come to grips with it. A bloody mess crowned the back end of Joe's lifeless body. A man in a Hawaiian-like shirt was faced away from Trevor, standing to the left of Joe's remains. Opposite and facing him were Kent, Ash, and Samel. Three men gained a sense of seriousness as they noticed the group coming from around the enclosure. Kent immediately raised an assault rifle at the incoming threesome. This sudden change of emotional tempo flushed Trevor's veins to an icy cold temperature. There was also this change that cued the man in the Hawaiian shirt to spin around and look at Trevor. It was Paco. As he turned, everything seemed to be in slow motion for Trevor. He saw his Gramps now come into view, kneeled before his captor, hands behind his back. Trevor noticed, just beyond Paco, right outside the plane, sat the remaining four, bound and gagged. Trevor's completely heartbroken and shocked face refocused on his grandfather. Jack slowly raised his head and looked at Trevor. He mouthed to Trevor, "I'm sorry, Tiger." Paco stood next to him with a handheld gun in his right hand, pointed at Jack's head. He had the biggest smile on his face as Trevor tried to say something, but no words came out. Paco kept his smiling stare right on Trevor. "Never mind, Jack. I found them." With that, Trevor watched the bullet enter his grandfather's skull as blood splattered the men surrounding him. Trevor dropped to his knees as his two friends on either side caught him from completely falling to his face. Through all the tears and ringing in his ears, he could barely see or hear Paco approaching him. A very thick Hispanic accent began to echo his entire being. "Trevor? Trevor? Snap out of it, amigo. We got some fun stories to tell you. Plus," he added, while still walking up to the three, huddled to the ground. He came to a knee and leaned into Trevor's ear and gently whispered, "Plus, we have some wonderful new cages to show you."